portfolio, link those. When I first started out, I just had random short blips of music for different moods or different, potential environments in a video game. And those pieces helped me get on my first few game jam teams and sort of got the ball rolling before I had actual, games with other game jam soundtracks to link as my portfolio. And just in general, I think it's useful to make stuff you enjoy and expand your portfolio even if it's something that's not attached to a game yet. And if you are just starting out, it's your first game jam, communicate that to your teammates. There's tons of people out there who are looking for teams that are very enthusiastic and eager, and they're open about being beginners, and they just want to get some hands-on experience together. So it's a very friendly environment for all skill levels and all experience levels. Once you've done a few game jams and strengthened your portfolio, you can afford to be a little bit more discerning with the people you team up with. So now that I have a few jams under my belt, I'll typically ask if a programmer wants to team up with me. I'll ask them to link their itch.io profile, check and see if they seem like a good match for me. If you ever get on a team and the vibe feels off, or it's not really what you're looking for at the start, communicate that to them, that you're going to find another team, so they have time to find another musician, and then you have time to find other arrangements. So at the beginning of a game jam, when you get into a team, you kind of have to understand or define your role as a musician. Each game jam that I've been on has been wildly different. Sometimes the whole team is involved in the idea-making process. Sometimes, the programmer and artist, they're friends and they have a vision, and I'm just making the music that I'm told. Sometimes I get to be involved in the game design because that's a personal interest of mine, so if there's an opportunity, I'll take it. Sometimes I get to write some story or dialogue. A lot of times musicians will be asked to do the sound effects, which personally is not my favorite, but a lot of people are into that. But just something to be aware of. There's a lot of different ways to go about it. I've been on a lot of different size teams that have different needs, so kind of ask yourself, what skills do you want to be exercising outside of just music, if any, and how can you do that on your team and communicate that to your team. And you may need to adapt slightly to every situation. And a few things that I found: the musician typically has less hours of total work to do compared to especially the programmer, but even sometimes the artist. And as a musician, I often feel like I have the least sway over the direction of the game, partially because of that. Feels like the programmer and artist have a big impact, so just something to be aware of as the musician. And then, acknowledging that everyone's creative process is different. Everyone has different tools at their disposal. Everyone makes music in different ways. So try and figure out what a game jam looks like for you, and what tools you have at your disposal. How much time do you need to do what you need to do for a game jam? Do you need to incorporate time? Do you need to make an idea and then come back to it later with fresh ears to finalize it? When you start a game jam, can you draw inspiration from somewhere? Are there references, or is there just something that you're interested in genre-wise that you can bring to the game? And then just logistically, what software or instruments are you using to make music? How can you best utilize that within the context of your game? And does your own personal process or tools affect the potential genre or vibe of the game you can compose music for? Does that affect which game jams you're joining? But also get out of your comfort zone if you can, and try unfamiliar genres and style of music and game. I often, sometimes I'll be working on a track for 3 or 4 hours, and then I'll realize it's not a good fit after all, or it's not at all what I set out to make, and I have to stop and restart. And I have to remind myself that that's not a waste of time. You know, that's part of the process. And then sometimes I have a song that comes together in, you know, half an hour or something. I just have a couple other notes here about making music and creativity. How many of you are familiar with the gap, the concept of the gap? A couple people. I feel like it's a helpful concept to know for any creative, but it's basically just, you know, when you're starting any skill, or even when you're intermediate in any skill, there's going to be a gap between your own ability and your taste in that you know, your taste in music versus your own ability, or your taste in painting versus your own painting ability. And I think game jams are a great way to practice and cross that gap. That's the hardest part when you're early on in your craft and you're making stuff, but it's not quite up to like what you would like to listen to. But the more you practice, the more you'll start to cross that gap. And I wanted to talk about something else I noticed with any creative endeavor. You know, when you create a piece of art, whether it's a music, painting, or anything, you kind of see it build up from nothing into something. So there's a tendency, at least in my experience, to see you know, a piece of music as a collection of parts. You hear the snare separately, you hear the hi-hats, you hear that synth separately, and all those parts, you know, some of them might have turned out differently than you imagined, and it can be hard to feel good about your own work, especially right after you've completed it and all that information is in your head. But just rest assured, someone seeing your work for the first time doesn't have all this extra information in their head. They're going to be seeing things as a whole from the first impression, and they may be able to appreciate your work in a way you cannot yet. It's just a comforting thought, I think, and you know, when you come back to your own work later on, you might have lost some of that information about all the individual pieces and see your own work in a new light. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about making a jam soundtrack. So you got on your team, your team has an idea, they're moving forward with it. My advice is to stop and wait and start to let the game take shape before you make music. Maybe there's things you can do right from the get-go, but typically I find that I'm most successful when I can wait for some of the art from the artist to drop in the Discord and let the art style influence the sound. You know, I'll typically share this with my team and encourage the artists to share their progress as they go. And I think the subconscious really matters. At the beginning of a jam, I might be kind of in my head like, what should this game sound like? What's the mood? What's the vibe? But then once I see the art, once I see some of the animations or the setting, it'll start to click into place in my head, and I'll start to, you know, have ideas on the instrumentation, the tempo, the genres that I should be working with. So just let the other people on your team kind of fuel your subconscious. So I kind of like to hang back and let my team know that I'm gonna see what comes out first before I can start making the music. And also, you know, it's useful to ask your team for references. What do they see this game as sounding like, and can you incorporate that? And then as the game takes shape, you know, what's playing during the main gameplay? Are there going to be different areas? Like, I'm looking for opportunities to make a few different tracks. You know, is there going to be a menu? Is there going to be a game over screen? Or is there like a narrative bit at the start? All of those things are good things to think about. And yeah, so once I have my direction, the game's starting to take shape, I'm starting to make some music, I like to simulate in these game jams, you know, making a cohesive soundtrack. So what instruments and sounds feel like your game's setting and vibe. I like to, you know, reuse melodies or motifs throughout a game jam soundtrack just to practice that skill. For me, it's much more artistically fulfilling to make a mini soundtrack, because then you can, like, use the same instruments between different tracks and kind of, I don't know, it's just satisfying to practice making a whole soundtrack. And I love using the same melodies across tracks, even if I like warp them for different needs, because the listener subconsciously will know this, and it'll give the game like a more cohesive vibe. Should you stay in a similar key for all of the music on the soundtrack, or maybe you have a game over screen where you dramatically shift from that key. And lastly, if you're not sure, if you're working on a piece of music and you're not sure if it's a fit with the game, encourage the programmer to get an early build of the game on itch.io or something where you can just walk around and like let your music play in the background and see if it's a good fit. So here I'm going to play an example from my second ever game jam. There's this fun game called Shroomancer where you're like a little mushroom guy raising mushrooms from the ground, and you're trying to basically beat up like bugs and stuff, and then you break them down and you like decompose them into resources, and you use those resources to cast a big like forest restoration spell. So I'm going to share a little bit from that soundtrack here, and pay attention to the flute melody. I'm going to share like just a little snippet of different songs on this soundtrack, and I tried to reuse and recycle the same flute melody. Let me get the right timestamp here. Okay, yeah, listen to the flute. So this is the menu track. Melody is just that dun, 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 dun. So I have that in the menu, and then if I go to, so it's just the same flute melody, and again at the end, when you win the game, basically. So nothing like terribly groundbreaking here, but you can.
Other thing?
I just wanted to demonstrate that you can practice this skill within the context of a game jam, and I think it's really artistically rewarding, and it's great practice. So the next topic, within a game jam, can you practice making a dynamic soundtrack, even if it's really simplistic? I think this can make a huge difference in the player experience. It can really stand out, especially in a game jam. Of course, the industry standard, they use software like Wise or Fmod. So if you want to use those, I think that's great, have at it. I haven't actually practiced with those programs yet, so that's kind of the next step for me. But you can still achieve a lot dynamically with simple fading in and out of music in response to gameplay. One approach I often take is I'll create one track, but then I'll just duplicate the project in my DAW, and I'll change certain layers, and I'll just fade in between those two different versions of the track in response to a gameplay trigger. And you might have to explain to the programmer, have these both play at the same time, but have this one at volume 0 and this one at 100, and fade into them in response to something. So I've used that in a few different ways. I'm going to play a clip from Birdbound, which is one of my favorite jam games I've been a part of. This is sort of like a mix of getting those rage games, like Getting Over It, and also like Flappy Bird. So the goal is to climb this tall tower. So I basically have 3 versions of the same track for each third of the tower. So as you climb, the music will change and it'll just add a few layers. So I have an example clip here of different layers. Very calm at the bottom. And then in a second, the bird will start flying. Hi-hats coming in there, some more synths. And the programmer, I just had him, play all 3 versions of the track at the same time and just fade in to the appropriate one as you climb. If you fall back down, it goes back to the earlier version of the track. The final layer just comes in. There's more drums, there's even a little bass, and there's some higher bell-like voices. So that was another one. I have a second example here from a game I was part of called Cleanup on Dungeon Isle. So this was for a turn-based dungeon crawler game jam, and early on in the planning process, I was like, it would be quite abrupt if the player, whenever they enter combat, the music is restarting every time. So I try to think about, maybe the music for exploring around the dungeon can fade into the combat music and fade back out seamlessly. So that's what I try to do with this one. And the concept of this game is that you're the janitor cleaning up the dungeon after the event and resetting traps after the adventurers leave. You're cleaning up blood and debris. So when the combat is triggered, it kind of seamlessly fades into the combat. And that works no matter, when the combat is triggered. And then when the combat ends in a second here, you'll see it transition back to the exploration theme. So you can see that just simple fading in and out of things can be quite effective, especially if you can, and then to be able to do that, you need to communicate that to your programmer and your team. So let's talk about team communication. First off, in game jams, I've made a lot of meaningful friendships that have lasted beyond jams, or I've met them in real life, and now they're part of my friend circle. So game jams are a great way to meet people, and also making friends is networking when it comes to game jams. If you've attended other similar panels at MAGFest with various creatives giving advice on how to break into the games industry, I often hear the sentiment that Many professionals are getting their opportunities through referrals by friends or friends of friends, and game jams are the perfect place to befriend game devs, artists, etc., who will get to see your skills in action, and may have other projects upcoming or on the back burner that they can help you get involved with. So if it feels right during a jam, make friends with your team. Participate in some jokes and discussion in the Discord. You never know what might come of it. So now on to talking about music with your team, which can sometimes be challenging, communicating about music to non-musicians, or just everyone has different skill levels when it comes to music and different areas of expertise. So one thing I found is, like, sometimes I'll be working on something and I'll get excited about it and I'll share it with the team even though it's unfinished or an early idea, and I'll get and I'll try to communicate like, oh, this is just a draft or this is incomplete, but then my team will be like, it sounds a little incomplete or sounds a little sparse or something. So share progress with your team, but when you have like something meaningful to share, just be mindful of what you're sharing and what their perspective might be. But sharing music throughout the whole process and explaining things to your team as the jam goes on can help the team stay excited and engaged, and shows that you're engaged in the project, which can be important because sometimes these game jam teams fizzle out if there's a vibe that no one's really like working on anything. And as the musician, it can be easy to be like just on your own little island sometimes, so it's good to share with the team. And sometimes the artist will feed off of the music's vibe as you go, and vice versa, so you have a little bit of a feedback loop of creativity going there. Also be open to feedback from your team. Making artists vulnerable. Sometimes I get a little bit defensive if I'm really proud of something and my team doesn't digest it in the way that I expect them to. But some of my most proud works come from taking a step back and listening to the feedback that my team is giving me, trying to understand it and improving the work based on that. People who don't typically work with music may not always know how to talk about music either. And I'll get a piece of feedback that I feel maybe isn't accurate or misunderstands what I'm trying to do, and it's just a miscommunication. So as the musician, it can be important to identify the root feeling that maybe this person is getting that's causing this feedback. Even if their stated reason doesn't sound accurate to, maybe there's something you can tease out there. So just try to like step back from their literal suggestions sometimes and think about like what might be making them feel that way from your own perspective as the creator of the music. And then you also have to be very clear with the programmer about implementation if you're not implementing your own music. Clearly labeling files, which ones are the final version. Sometimes I have to like repeat and reiterate my intended implementation a lot, because it's a game jam, especially as you get down to the wire. The programmer has a lot of stuff going on. There's files flying around in the Discord. So repeat and reiterate and label things, especially if you have a dynamic element, or specify which tracks need to loop. Put all the files in an easily accessible space, do a Google Drive or something, and sometimes I'll even create a spreadsheet with instructions on how to implement everything, and with the corresponding file names, especially if you end up doing sound effects. I think that's a really effective strategy. And then understand the needs of your game in terms of file types. I often use OGG files. Just someone who knew a little bit more than me about audio implementation told me to use those files once in my first jam, and I think it's a better like compression algorithm than MP3. OGG files, they're really easy to, you can convert your WAV file or anything to an OGG using Audacity. You just put the file in Audacity and export it as an OGG file. And I'd love to be able to send WAV files in Discord, but I'm a peasant and I don't have Nitro. So sometimes I'm sharing music with my team as an MP3 file, but then I have to make sure that that's not the version that the programmer implements. So just a lot of communication around files and implementation. And finally, the final topic is managing expectations for a game jam, because game jams are not always for the faint of heart. You will have to battle disappointment, and it's just the nature of the beast. Sometimes the scope of your game, often actually, the scope of your game is going to be severely reduced from the initial ideas your team came up with when you were starry-eyed at the beginning of the jam. The realities of the project and everyone's time commitment become clear. Sometimes things might not be finished in a game jam. Some tracks that you prepared won't get used or used as intended, or sometimes the game might be unplayable or bugged or just not finished. The team will often talk about, like, after the jam ends, we're gonna fix these bugs. In my experience, it rarely happens because everyone's motivation dries up once the deadline is not hanging over everyone's head. So what do you do in these situations? I think first and foremost, you just have to understand that everyone is juggling their real life, and this is, unpaid, like, passion project stuff, and people are practicing, things come up. It can be frustrating as the musician and feel like your portfolio in terms of games are dependent on how much the programmer is able to manage their time. But do your best to be kind and prioritize working with those who are considerate of your time commitment and work. But also take control of your own portfolio and decenter it from, don't just have an itch.io page. For example, I post all of my work on YouTube. I try to, I have like a blue sky, and try to mix it up and get other value out of my music beyond just, it's in this game, this itch profile. Sometimes I even share a finished soundtrack for a game that never got completed. In cases where work is unused and it seems like an easy fix, sometimes I will, gently encourage the programmer or my team to implement it if there's anything at all possible. But like I said, if it's like a bug or gameplay improvement thing, I wouldn't expect it to get fixed after the jam is over. And when you need to, like, stand up for yourself within a team, but be polite and empathetic, and be mindful that you're still networking regardless of the outcome of the game. Still, despite all of these, disappointments and potential things that can go wrong, I still think you should go all out. And a full disclaimer, like, I definitely do too much for a game jam. It's just my preferred way to work. I'll make a 2-minute long menu track that people will hear for about 5 seconds as they're clicking through like 15 games in one evening. And I think I heard a statistic that each person plays each jam game for about 5 minutes. But I like to make these 5 to 11 minute soundtracks, or I'll have a game over track that's like 2 minutes long, and no one's ever going to hear it because it's not even possible to really lose the game. But I think it's just artistically satisfying, and it's good personal development and practice. And then you get to exercise, recycling the melodies between tracks. Sometimes it really works out, and you have a great game, and you have a great soundtrack, and it all comes together. That's awesome. Your team will also notice your creative output, so it's part of great networking. And like I said, decenter your portfolio from the programmer and from other people. So no matter what, if I know I'm going above and beyond or I'm doing too much for a game jam, I'm like excited because I'm like, oh, my YouTube will have a nice full soundtrack video, and that's satisfying to me. And some logistics, if you're posting somewhere else, make sure to get permission from your team and the other artists, the programmer, to share their work. I feel like I've never had an artist tell me that they didn't want me to share their work. I think they appreciate the exposure too. I'll usually link their portfolio, whatever they want me to, in the description. I'll send it to them when the video is posted and say, is there anything you want to change or add to this? Is there any portfolio that I missed? I think also having your own portfolio makes you a bigger asset to the team. I'll usually link all of the games in the description of the YouTube videos. I had one situation where the cleanup on Dungeon Isle soundtrack did unexpectedly well on YouTube, I think because it was like a popular genre, a music genre, and that was getting more people to play the game, and then so the programmer suddenly locked in, he's like, I suddenly got inspired to do bug fixes this weekend. So having your own portfolio it's also power, and you can wield that a little bit in a place where musicians don't always have the most power on these game jam teams. And then of course, having a YouTube portfolio or similar makes it much easier to get on more experienced game jam teams in the future as you gain experience. So we're nearing the end of the talk. I just have a few random closing tidbits about game jams. Pay attention to the game jam length. I find that often like the 3 to 14 day game jams are most successful because you have to start and successful in terms of like your team actually sticks it out to the end, because you have to start and there's no time to waste and everyone's kind of like working on it constantly, versus I've been in some 1 or 2 month game jams, which sounds awesome. It's like, oh, what can we make in 2 months? But oftentimes people will wait around and not start until a month in, or they'll like lose motivation halfway through. But I've had 1 or 2 month game jams work out sometimes too, so there's a risk involved, but just be mindful of that. Another thing, once your team has submitted your game jam game, take some time to play the other submissions in the game jam. It's very inspiring. There's all kinds of hidden gems out there. You'll find like, there's just so much, I'll be in a game jam, there's like 700 entries, and there's just so much beautiful art being made, and it's inspiring. And leave thoughtful, complimentary, and constructive comments on other teams' games, because it shows what game you made for the jam in your comments. So people will click on your game and leave comments on yours. So it's a good way to get more eyes on your own game as well. And work with people you trust across multiple projects if you can. If you have like a really good programmer artist team, that can be fun. But also don't forget to mix it up and work with new people sometimes to keep expanding your network. So that's basically the end of my talk. I'm happy to answer questions. I have my links. If people want to reach out to me on Discord, or if you want a copy of these slides or anything, there's my Discord username. There is an underscore after the name, so be mindful of that. I need to thank all of the artists and programmers and sound designers whose work I showcased in this presentation. And if you can, rate me on the guidebook app once you're done. But I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has any. Yeah.
When you're looking for game jams, how needed do you find yourself to be versus like the programmers and the artists?
Yeah, it's a good question. Every time I go into a game jam forum, it feels like it feels like a ton of musicians looking for a team. I feel like, but it's weird because I talk to people around MAGFest, or I talk to devs in the indie showcase, and they say that they have trouble finding musicians, or that it feels like there's a lack of musicians. So I'm trying to figure out what that's about, but you will see a lot of other musicians in the team recruitment channels, but I think also like let your style speak for itself. I've noticed that people will just like, someone will like connect with your style, and they'll be like, hey, I like your stuff. So you're not you're competing against a lot of people, but it's just cool to see that everyone's making art together, and someone will click with your style if you post your stuff. Or if you take the initiative. One thing I don't do enough is like take the initiative and start a team too. Usually I'm just trying to join an existing team, but if you're down for that, that can be a good way to like jumpstart it. If you reach out to a pixel artist or a programmer and like form a team and kind of take more of an initiative there, that might give you an edge. Yeah.
Aside from like the, you mentioned like one of the things you help use to decide like what jam to join is the time frame. Are there other like aspects that you use when determining like what you're gonna do? Because if you're like, hey, I want to do a game jam next week, and there's 15 different 2-week jams, like how do you figure out like what's a good fit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a big part of it is just like personal preference and theme. Like, I don't know, like a theme like around Halloween, like a spooky game jam would be fun. So that's kind of interesting. I also look at you can organize things on itch.io. You can filter them by like how many people are already joined for this jam. So sometimes I like to try to join bigger ones because I feel like it's a better chance of finding a team and it's just more interesting and inspiring to be a part of. But other than that, I think it's just down to personal preference. And I've had great experiences on smaller jams as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So how do you work with people that have like wildly different schedules? Because I work like a full-time job at work where like I have wildly different times. Like sometimes I wake up at 10 to go to work and I end work at 3, or like I have to wake up at 5 in the morning for work.
Yeah.
So how do you manage like people that have those type of schedules?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the question was how to manage different schedules. I think game jams are a great place. You'll find that people around the world are joining this jam, so you'll often be in different time zones than everyone else anyway. And everyone's pretty understandable about very few people are doing this as their main thing. Everyone's got jobs, everyone's got responsibilities, so just communicating with your team about like your time zone and roughly, like I'll tell my team that I'll probably be on late at night typically on Eastern time, or like even if I'm going on a trip or I'm going away for a weekend, I'll tell my team, I probably won't make much progress this weekend, but I'll try to send something by Tuesday, so just be communicative, and then I think everyone's very welcoming about different schedules, and it's not usually an issue. Any more questions? All right. Well, thank you for joining today. This was fun.